You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Ryan Puzycki, who writes at the City of Yes. We have a discussion on urban disorder, how it manifests, and how to address the upstream impacts instead of when it's too late. We also talk about enforcing norms and the impacts of media on our perceptions. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super amazing and kind Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of bus riders, bus drivers, and chupistas, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. And if you want to just give a single $1 a month, you'll be able to get the podcast with 0 outside ads or podcast recommendations in Patreon. We'll leave information in the show notes about how to get the show in your podcatcher. We'll also recently put up some bonus material, including audio of my first ever e-bike ride, and have a weekly free post from our newsletter intro, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, get your heavyweight bus and bike scarves. You'll definitely need one for you, your friends, your colleagues, just to show everyone in that city hall or legislature your advocacy in clothing that won't get taken by security on the way in. If you want to get one of the bus or bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf for hot climates, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. But there are many other ways to support the show, including buying books from us on the bookshop site, either the books from our authors that we interview or any book you like. bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. And for anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook that plays like a podcast, visit theoverheadwire.com. You can also get that podcast from Libby at your public library. And finally, definitely sign up for the 20-year-old newsletter we do at theoverheadwire.com, established in 2006, and our over 110,000 item link archive tagged by topic and city. We'll leave a YouTube explainer video in the show notes as well for that one too. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that as well. You can find us mostly on Blue Sky and Mastodon, sometimes on Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. We've got some great stuff coming up for you in our 13th year of the podcast, so keep on listening for announcements on gatherings, but for now, just enjoy the show. Hey everybody, I decided to move this part of my thank yous up from the post-credits to right here smack dab at the start because I do want to recognize the folks who are Dallas tier or higher Patreon supporters. It really helps us out and we super appreciate it. When I get new supporters, I'll update this section, so I hope that happens often. So first names only, but big thanks to Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabriel, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mal, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Abraham, Oliver, Steve, Abby, Matthew, Sylvia, and recently added Andrew A. All right, thank you all very much. Let's get to the show. Ryan Puzycki, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm based in Austin, Texas, where I am an advocate for better housing and transit. I'm also on the city zoning commission, and I spend most of my time writing a Substack called City of Yes, where I explore urbanism and urban issues.
Have you always been interested in cities?
I've always been interested in cities, and I spent all of my adult life living in them, between Boston and New York, Austin, San Francisco. I did stints in London and Madrid, but I have not always worked in the urbanism space. I haven't written about it until really just the past few years. I used to be in Montessori education where I built and managed schools for about a decade. And there were kind of two aspects of that brought me into this world. One was just trying to build schools in San Francisco and Brooklyn, which was kind of a nightmare, just working through the gamut of red tape and the conflicting bureaucracies that had requirements that didn't quite align with each other. But we still managed to get schools open. But when people ask why is preschool so expensive, I'm like, well, it's very hard to do. So that's part of it. But the other side of that was just seeing, especially in San Francisco, how we had this constant churn in our school community between teachers who were getting burned out because they could only afford housing, 90 minutes away in the South Bay, people coming in from Fremont each day, or, San Jose, and, you're sitting in traffic, you're sitting on BART. It just, over time, that just adds up, and people don't want to do it anymore when it's 3 hours of their life.
Plus taking care of 4-year-olds, 3 and 4
right.
right?
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Seems very, very stressful.
Yeah, no, for sure. And then, families would have a different version of that where, you're living in a small apartment, you've got one kid, you're paying this expensive tuition. And suddenly baby number 2 comes along. And for us, it's always like, hooray, but because we know that means they're going to be choosing, can we afford to stay here? Can we do 2 tuitions or another bedroom? And a lot of the time, the families would choose to leave the city. And so this was in the 2017, 2020 timeframe, and just sort of seeing that happening in real time in San Francisco, I was just thinking about what can we do at the school to fix this? And started to think more about like YIMBY politics and policy otherwise, and got involved a little bit. And then the pandemic happened, and sort of every single pathology about urban life sort of came to the forefront during that time. It was all I was thinking about other than trying to keep our school afloat. And we did that. We ended up stabilizing the school and selling it. And that question was still very much on my mind. What is going on in cities? What is their future? How can we solve them? And so I just started to do a lot of reading. I ended up moving to Austin. I got very involved in local politics here very quickly with this urbanist group called Aura, which I'm now on the board of. We did a whole bunch of housing reforms, got appointed to the zoning commission related to my work doing that. And then just was writing about this stuff and learning about it and trying to kind of figure out what was going on. And so I have the Substack now. It's been doing fairly well, but it's mostly me just learning out loud and sharing what I'm learning with people. So I'm not an expert on this stuff. I don't feel like an expert, at least, but I am well read and kind of have been in the trenches and some of the experience side here in the city.
I feel like we all have a little bit of imposter syndrome, right?
Yeah.
Also, and I'll talk about this in a little bit as well, but I think that's interesting that your work was in this subset of care infrastructure. And I think that's really fascinating because there is this kind of movement around the United States, especially in some circles related to thinking about how we should care for people, whether that's the aging population, whether that's kids, how that impacts parents, how that impacts people who are trying to take care of their elderly parents, the idea of healthcare, those types of things. So it's kind of in this overarching umbrella, and I'm sure that we'll get into the discussion about care infrastructure, but I think that's a really fascinating kind of angle that you're coming from.
Yeah, and I agree. And just like running a school, you kind of see how difficult it can be to provide that. I mean, we were not running what I would call like an affordable school. We had a small scholarship program that was entirely funded by families who paid full tuition. So our school relied on people being able to afford, $30,000 a year to send their kids to preschool. That's not sustainable. You can't do that at scale. I fully understand that. We focused on trying to run a good school, but it was only if we had 220 kids in our program. How do we serve an entire city if those are the economics?
Yeah, it's tough. And some cities are trying to figure that out. I know New York City is focused on childcare and things like that, but that's just one of the many different calculations about all this stuff. And cities are in the center of it, I think.
For sure.
Well, so I wanted to have you on the show because you recently wrote a piece about urban disorder. And this is a topic that I've long avoided actually talking about, especially here in San Francisco, because I feel like you can really, put your foot in your mouth pretty easily and pretty fast based on different opinions and stuff. But I think it should be discussed because it's really important.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what first brought you to it, because you wrote a piece about it. What first kind of got you thinking about this idea that urban disorder maybe needs to be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you've been living in any of the, quote unquote, high opportunity cities in the past 10, 20 years, you can't but help think about disorder because it is visible in many, many places. And I'd say certainly since the pandemic, that's become more true. In that piece and others I've written about, I've talked about living in San Francisco's Mission District just pre-pandemic and then while the pandemic was happening. And, homelessness, people shooting up was just part of life. We'd be taking the dog for a walk and she'd be sniffing something. And we'd realize it's a used needle and we're immediately trying to tug her back.
Yeah.
I was crossing the intersection at Van Ness Market at one point, and there was just like a pile of hundreds of needles in the street. And I was like, did these fall off of the back of a truck or something? Like, what was this? So, it was always kind of there. I kind of was like, this is what it is to live here in San Francisco, at least. But I did have an experience like living in Manhattan for 10 years before that. And Manhattan didn't have that. Like, there was certainly a lot of homeless people in New York, but New York had homeless shelters. You didn't really see the, flagrant drug abuse and things like that. So I at least had an inkling that like, there's another way to go about this. Not necessarily that New York has solved its problems or maintained the level that it had achieved, but certainly compared to San Francisco, at least there was a difference. And then I came to Austin, and Austin is somewhere in between those two. It's vastly overstated by many of the people here who hate Austin and love to dunk on it. But we do have a lot of visible homelessness. We do have a large total homeless population. You don't see the drugs so much, but you do see mentally ill people walking into the street. I mean, I have to pass through the east side of downtown Austin, which is where we have our homeless shelter for men as well as one for women. But you see people who don't really have anywhere to go during the day or anything to do. Some of them seem like they need treatment or help, but they're standing in the middle of traffic or wandering into traffic and they don't seem to be aware that they're there. And that's dangerous not only for those people, but also for the people who are driving when somebody erratic enters the right of way. And so it's a long way of saying that I think we all, if we live in cities like this, we all kind of live with it in a certain way. And I just had a sense that maybe that we shouldn't have to. Now, why I wrote this particular piece was because I often see from certain like center right people or conservative identifying people this idea that, well, disorder is a function of like American individualism. And that just didn't sit quite right with me. And so what I was trying to explore in this piece is this perceived tension between individualism or liberalism or whatever you want to call it and, public order. And so that was kind of the genesis of it. And a couple other writers, Chris Arnatti, who writes a Substack about walking around the world, and then Addison Del Mastro wrote another piece riffing off of that, in which they were kind of discussing these ideas. And I wanted to engage with that and kind of press on some of their formulations of this problem.
Yeah, I read both of those pieces, and I guess it's not criticism, but just kind of changing the frame of how they were speaking about it. And Chris's perspective is basically we're too individualistic as a society, and Addison's was we believe too much in an American-specific folk libertarianism, which is what you kind of put in your paper, or you can't tell me what to do-ism kind of feeling. And I'm wondering what you took from those arguments, and specifically about this kind of idea of individualism. And specifically, I'm interested in the folk libertarianism aspect.
Yeah. So one of the things I wanted to do in that piece was to distinguish between various ways that we throw around this word individualism. I think we abuse the phrase sometimes to mean a whole bunch of things. So I was trying to separate political individualism, which I think is kind of the system of American rights, constitutionalism, institutional governance, from this idea of just basic individuality or, flying your freak flag or whatever.
Yeah.
And these things do interact. They are related, but they are not quite the same thing. And I think what Addison was doing in this idea of folk libertarianism was identifying, yes, this kind of like, we'll call it strain of mind your own business, don't tell me what to do, that definitely exists in the American spirit, I guess, in American culture. But it is not quite the same thing, or not necessarily necessitated by, I would say, the underlying political philosophy aspect of it. So I was pushing back, I guess, on saying that guarantees or defines this kind of realm of disorder that we inhabit.
And to go back even further in history and thinking about individualism, I mean, I don't know if you read Yoni Applebaum's book, Stuck.
Yeah,
but
it's a great book.
It was fascinating to hear about kind of the historical antecedents to settlement, right? So the northern versus the southern attitudes towards building a community. And the northern attitude was, let's build a community, but everybody that was born here, we are responsible for. We're responsible for their well-being, their jobs, their health, their all these things.
Yeah.
And in the South, it was more individualistic, right? Like they were like, okay, every man for himself. We're here for profits, and we're gonna, build these plantations. There's a stratification of wealth, right? So there's a very poor and that worked the land. There was the slaves, and then there was the very rich. And then during the book, he talks about George Washington's travel logs, noting this difference between the North and the South, and it led to this really fascinating quote, which is, the result was a country where people expected contradictory things, absolute freedom to do what they wanted with their own property while expecting to control what their neighbors did with theirs. And I feel like there's like the connection there between the property rights aspect of it and, how people expect you to treat them specifically as individuals.
Yeah, well, I think this is really fundamental to like what a city is all about. It's about how do strangers coexist together in density. I have an essay called The Sanctuary Suburb, in which I'm basically arguing that the whole point of the suburb was to separate people from the obligations of urban life, of living with density. And so what ended up happening was the cities ended up getting dumped with all of the problems of the social problems, while the suburbs could live, I guess, separated from the consequences of it. But yes, so I think what's interesting about the quote you just gave, well, was the South really individualistic? I mean, not from the perspective of a slave, right?
Right. Yeah.
So like one of the core tenets of American liberalism and of individualism is that you can't be enslaved, you can't be murdered. Obviously, we failed to make that across the board when we founded the country, but I think a lot of what American history has been fighting towards, a truer realization of at least the initial promise. I mean, Jefferson himself penned the words that he spent the rest of his life ignoring. So I guess I maybe push back against Yanni there, but with
That's fair.
too. But yes, I mean, our country is of course full of contradictions. We've been from the beginning. We see that in our cities here. In the same piece about the sanctuary suburbs. Well, a lot of cities call themselves sanctuary cities, and then they don't build enough housing and forcing people who live there to move out. So we say we care about the homeless. Again, we don't provide treatment centers for the mentally ill. We don't provide enough beds for those who are on the streets. We have this tendency to, and I don't know if this is just like we've inherited from our boomer parents or whatever, this sense of entitlement to not have to have trade-offs. Like we expect, New York City is going through this right now. Mayor Mamdani had a lot of goals and visions for when he came into office of things he wanted to do, and well, he actually has to produce a budget first, and they're making trade-offs in real time about, well, what can we actually do here, and how do we fund it, and how do we pay for it, because there are limits. And those are imposed by reality. And so, I don't know, I feel like a lot of American life today, and politics in particular, is wanting to have it both ways. Nobody ever has to hurt. Nobody has to, contribute. Nobody has to share in this great thing we call public life. But yet we still want the benefits of it. So yeah, I mean, I guess I have some frustration with that notion.
I mean, and it's fair. To build a city, you need to have a collective action. And, as you mentioned in the piece, I mean, basically, you're looking at all of these institutions that have been created to build cities. And at the moment, we're kind of neglecting them. And I feel like that neglect, and like you say, is like leading to some of these problems that we're seeing, the lack of housing, the lack of, and we mentioned before, care, infrastructure. Yep. And so what happens is people who are out on their luck, or they have problems that they are facing, they are stuck without a solution, or they're trying to do things on their own, which that individualism isn't really fair to them and isn't really fair to everybody else.
Yeah, I think within the context of a city, it's inhumane to not help those who can no longer help themselves, whether because they are addicted to drugs or because they are mentally ill. It is not humane. It is not compassionate to let people wander on the streets into traffic where they might and probably will kill themselves. It's not humane, in my view, to let people overdose on drugs. Drug addiction is a disease. It's a tragedy. We should be trying to cure people of it, not facilitating it, which is, I think, a mistake San Francisco has made. So that is, in my view, a responsibility of a society and of a city. And, it's always the cities, of course, that are going to deal with it anyway. But a lot of those problems could have been prevented further upstream. How did somebody get into homelessness in the first place? Most people don't enter homelessness because they're addicted to drugs or because they're mentally ill. Sometimes, but once you become homeless because you got evicted, you couldn't afford your house, there wasn't new supply, so rents went up, which is what we've seen everywhere. If you were put on the street suddenly, I don't know what I would do. My life depends right now on electricity, on air conditioning, on access to water, on a bathroom, and a bed. I have a chili pad on my bed to keep it cool. Like, I can't, I have a very bougie sleeping arrangement. Like, if I'm on the street, I'm dead. Your life can fall apart so quickly, and then you have to hold down a job. You have to take your kids to school. You haven't showered. You're living out of your car. I just, it's incomprehensible to me. And yet this is a thing that happens to people all the time. Now, some of those people get through the shelter system and we don't ever see them, but some of them don't. That's a lot of men. It's a lot of Black men in Austin. That's at least the demographic. And well, we don't really have an answer for them other than there's a greenway down the outside of downtown where you can pitch a tent until we tell you to clean it up.
Yeah.
So
your sleeping arrangement reminds me of my wilderness survival merit badge that I earned in Boy Scouts. It sent you out into the woods with a tarp and then told you to fend for yourself. I didn't like it very much. I slept with a rock as my pillow and it was not comfortable. I can't imagine sleeping on the street is comfortable either. So, and also kind of some of the stats, like people talk about homelessness as this kind of overarching thing, but I don't know how many people understand, like you mentioned, like how it occurs, right? And research here in California specifically by PPIC and others have said, most of the folks who are homeless, they're functionally homeless. They live in their cars or they are sleeping couch to couch. And why it happens is because the safety net doesn't catch them. They're just one bad day away from their homelessness. And it's not any fault of their own. They had health problems. They couldn't pay their medical bills. Their home gets foreclosed on because they couldn't pay their rent, because they lost a job because of reasons, maybe it was health, this edge that people are on, that we've put them on because of the system that we operate. And I feel like if we had kind of a little bit more compassion and if we learned a little bit more about why this is happening, some of this research shows it, but we might understand a little bit better how to solve it. And I think there's a lot of people that do, but I think there's a lot of people that kind of push it aside. And, I think those individuality arguments are part of that. It's not coming to grips with the idea that there is an edge and a lot of people are living on it.
For sure. One of the contradictions that we have here, so I'll use Austin as an example, where we have a lot of visible homelessness similar to California. So people see homeless people putting up tents in greenways or, loitering around public spaces downtown, and they assume that's what the whole problem is. And so the city here, I think 2020, passed a camping ban, which then, of course, the Supreme Court, codified with the Grants Pass decision a couple of years ago, basically saying that states and cities can do that. Okay, well, you can't sleep on the sidewalk anymore. You can't put up a tent there, but where can you sleep? The same people who voted for that were also not building housing for 40 years. They refused homeless shelters in their neighborhoods. They said no to 100% affordable housing projects in their communities. And so, again, the contradiction of wanting to have it both ways. I don't want to see this, but yet I don't want to do any of the solutions that would make it go away for real. And so I would say there's an illiberal impulse to that lack of solutionism here, where we are going to exclude, control, decide who gets to live, in any particular place. What's the right housing typology? We can't have apartments in this part of town because it's been zoned for single family housing for a million years, even though it's right next door to downtown. Can't put a building of SROs somewhere close by because that will attract the wrong kind of people, So that is an illiberal impulse, this desire to control, I think. And so this is where the essay was trying to kind of bring it all together, that both of these things are illiberal, not what a allegedly or supposedly avowedly liberal city, a liberal society says they want. We want people to be housed, but yet we don't allow housing. So, well, we can only do one of those things, So if you are perpetually choosing not to build housing, then you are choosing the illiberal side of the equation there.
I also find it fascinating to think about cities as places where there are services and people go, and then they get hammered for being the places where people go.
Yes.
I think that's one of the frustrating things about San Francisco specifically is all the services and everything is basically in the Tenderloin, right? It's where many of the problems are, but nobody wants it in any other part of the city. And so, you have this force and then you have the national conservative machine telling everybody that San Francisco is a hellhole.
Right.
And I go outside on my street and I see blue skies and a wonderful community and like people walking around and I'm like, where is this coming from? Well, it's coming from the fact that we do have services for people and they are in this concentrated very heavily in this one neighborhood. And so you have this just like push for making, a scapegoat out of a place where people care a little, maybe more than others. There's a lot of places in San Francisco that don't care as well, but I think that that's an interesting part of it too. Is like a lot of the services and everything, the limited services, I should say, are kind of concentrated in cities. And so, what does that say about the way that we provide care for people in a larger way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a manifestation of a long-running, I'd say, anti-urban bias in American culture. It kind of reminds me of that meme where there's the guy like with the gun and he's killed somebody with it and he said, it's like your fault, the guy who got shot.
Yeah, Eric Andre. Yeah, the Eric Andre.
But this is the sort of like Jeffersonian, Hamiltonian, battle in American life where Jefferson, of course, had this idea of the human farmer and then it became the cowboy. And I don't know, in the 20th century, it was, driving a sedan on an open road or something as these like in symbols of American freedom. But of course, the human farmer was actually a plantation owner where the planting was done by slaves. And the cowboy was a myth created out of like 2 decades of, Texas grazing. Never really was a thing and it disappeared just as quickly as it arrived. But of course, the suburbs are the enduring aspect of American life. And I think anybody, probably listeners here, know that history of how the government subsidized the suburbs, bulldozed cities to build highways into the suburbs. And so, redlined the places where Jews and immigrants and Black people lived so they couldn't get access to capital and build wealth and move out to those suburbs themselves, and channeled all of the poor people, all of the people who needed services into the cities. There's an inelegant phrase from the kind of Victorian progressive era where, cities were called the dumping grounds of the poor. And to your point, like cities have always had to absorb, I would say, the problems of society, and the suburbs are this sort of escape valve from it. And they have surrounded themselves with exclusionary zoning to make that true. Mark Andreessen in Atherton opposed an apartment building there. I'm damn sure he's not going to allow a homeless shelter anywhere near his house. This is our history. Somehow, the ideal of American life is, the white picket fence on a large lot with a perfect little house and the dog and the kids and the 2.1 children or whatever it is. But that's been manufactured for, 200 years. So it's not surprising to me that we're still kind of fighting this battle. But yes, I do think that the culture has been oriented against cities, and cities get blamed for being responsible for solving the problems that have been foisted upon them.
I think your argument specifically about enforcement is really powerful as well. Cities are places of cooperation and shared knowledge and greater good, but without the guardrails of public responsibility and enforcement, they're not as good as they could be. I feel like we're backsliding away from kind of what we should be. And one of the reasons feels like we aren't enforcing a lot of these things that we should. There's a couple of items in your piece specifically of people doing things that are just illogical, not necessarily as an individual, but like the idea of somebody peeing in a subway car or shooting up in the subway hall or whatever it may be. Those are things that should be, I don't want to say punished, but just like the rules should be enforced, that people shouldn't be doing those things. And when we allow it, we actually degrade further, the push forward and societal goodness.
Yeah, I think so. Even I think there's like an aspect of, self-enforcement or self-governance here too. I wrote an essay earlier in the year called "The Age of Assholes." Excuse my French. It was about, these like civic norms, holding a door for somebody, saying please and thank you, but, not blasting TikTok when you're sitting on the subway, not, things like that, which, isn't a law against using your video in a crowded space. And I'm not sure there should be, but there should be a sense of like propriety that I am around other people who may not wish to hear what I'm doing. And so like, you tolerate that though, and well, why not somebody peeing? If we don't care about the space that we're all sharing together, why should anybody? And I think you kind of can get into this downward spiral of deteriorating just society. And I don't know, kind of feels like the American experiment right now at large in some ways.
Doing whatever we want.
Yeah.
You can't stop us.
Right. Flouting, so that the argument I made in that piece was, a tolerance for flouting the rules of civility ultimately leads to flouting more important rules like the Constitution. Maybe that's a logical leap, but I think there's a causal chain that gets you to that. Well, who cares about the rules? I don't know if that sounds like anybody we know in politics these days, but
maybe. What about social media? Like, what is like the impact of social media on these situations, and also like, kind of how they're treated as this political cudgel as well?
I try to not be on social media much outside of Substack. It's usually dispiriting to go on there. I think the anonymity, or even just hiding behind a handle, even if it's your own name, it's anonymizing in a certain way, but dehumanizing in a more fundamental way. And I don't think we interact with each other as humans there. I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago. Apologies for being so self-referential, but
No.
The piece was called "The Public Square is Not Online." I sort of kind of dramatizing, like, what if Twitter was real life? What if it was actually a public square? And like the behaviors that people do on there, they were doing in your real public square, like some, guy with a blue check standing up and just pronouncing his views to the rest of the square, and another guy on the other side doing the same thing. And then a bunch of little people, minnows around him, the reply guys, me too. People hiding behind the bushes who you don't know are there, but the vast, the silent majority, I guess. It would be ridiculous, right? It would be totally dysfunctional on its own. So I don't think it really, it's not a public square. It doesn't mimic, I think, what real in-person human interaction is. And I think this is not novel, but just brings out the worst in us and is meant to do that. So I don't know. I don't think good conversations happen there. I think they happen here, one-to-one or in person and whatnot. But it amplifies, I think, the bad. And of course, I don't know, on a fundamental level, it's just like the whole thing just kind of sucks in my view. So
I mean, I have to be on social media for my job.
Yeah.
I go through a lot of news items every day, and just like the negative news of it all, can get you down, and it's not healthy.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, in reading your piece specifically, like I noted every single social media thing that you were talking about. You were describing them as what they would be like if it was actually a real place. And I was like, oh, that's LinkedIn, that's Facebook, that's that, and it's unfortunate that I know the answers to those things, right? But I do. But I think that, for social media, as I was saying before, like since in San Francisco, a lot of this is concentrated, you can, point your camera at one corner of the street in one part of the city and say, this place is a horrible, horrible place. Whereas if you take it in totality, it's totally. Wonderful, wonderful place. And so I think that kind of hyper focus or ability to take things out of context is, I think, frustrating. And also just the manipulation that goes on now. The algorithm itself like suffocated actual information sharing. Unless you were being ostentatious, unless you were being combative, unless you were being anything you can think of that's kind of like over the top and not something you would do in what you said, a public square, you were pushed down in terms of your reach. And so I think that that's kind of where I stand on it, is like the whole thing of public disorder is actually amplified by these social media conglomerates, as it were. And in a worse way, the ideas that certain people want to pass through, those are the ones that get through. And so it changes the discussion, even if the discussion in real life isn't really like that. And so since so many journalists are on there as well, they soak that in and believe that this is real life. And there's a joke, Twitter is not real life, but then they believe that. And so they think that there's more attention to this one thing that's crazy out there left field or right field that actually didn't exist. Let's say like, for trans people, for example, like, obviously trans people exist, but are they taking over college sports? No. I mean, it's an insane, comment to make because it's not actually happening. But the public square hologram that is Twitter made it so that the people thought that was a thing. And so now there's all these people who are writing about it and people are reading about it. And it's like, this is not a thing. And this is not a thing that Americans care about. And so, I think public disorder from that standpoint is like, it's salacious and it's engrossing in the way that it aggregates your senses. And that is why it gets attention. And that is also why it makes it harder to solve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably true. The amplification effect isn't helping. And, there's like Austin-based Twitter accounts where like all they post is just videos of the encampments and whatnot. And it makes it seem like that's all Austin is. But then, I follow a lot of Austin boosters, and if you follow their feeds, there's nothing wrong with the city. It's this amazing place. It's like we have no problems at all. So it can work the other way too, I guess. But I mean, to your point, in my homelessness piece, that's basically the point I was making, was that everybody focuses on the visible parts of homelessness, and they don't realize that that's really just the tip of the iceberg. And so they're missing the upstream problems that are causing people to end up on the streets. So when they see the 6,000 number, they think, oh, of course, I've seen 6,000 homeless people in the city. It's like, no, you haven't. You've actually only seen maybe a couple thousand. There are 3,500 others who are going through shelter systems that you, I'm sure, never look into. New York too, 90% of the homeless population in New York is sheltered. In New York, you could be forgiven for never seeing a homeless person in Manhattan if that's where you spent all of your time, because they do a good job of hiding it. But it is a huge problem that masks maybe their housing shortage. So what I try to do in my pieces sometimes is reframe an issue, especially for people who are aware of a problem, but maybe don't realize how it's happening. I want to shine a light on the upstream causes of this thing, so that if we care, if you say, I'll take your word for it, you care about homelessness and the mentally ill, well, the best way we can do it is by, legalizing more housing, by funding mental health programs, diversion programs, things like that.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you about your solutions, because we can talk about it all day long, but there is a need for a discussion about like what needs to happen. I know that, for example, like I mentioned earlier on, there's a whole talk about care infrastructure and what we need to do. Yeah. And a lot of that, I think, like cuts into this. Here's another example I'm thinking about is like the bus system in San Francisco and Muni, and, people being afraid to ride because there's so many folks who ride it because it's the place of last resort. Well, people expect the transit agency to focus on that, but it's actually not necessarily their job. It's the city's job to focus on the housing and the care infrastructure and everything else that you were mentioning. So I'm curious what you think is like the best way to go about centering the problem, but also solving it where it actually is coming from, rather than like, the biopsychosocial model versus the biomedical model, where biomedical model, you solve it in the hospital as best you can when it's at the end stage, versus the biopsychosocial model, whereas like this is a societal thing that we should be working on. Where are the points that we need to focus on?
Yeah, I agree. Like, it's an apt analogy, because we think we should be dealing with homelessness and drug addiction on the street where we find it, rather than the place many years or steps back where somebody got evicted, somebody, couldn't find affordable housing, somebody lost their job or something like that. So I think with something like homelessness, there's no like monocausal explanation or solution for that matter. Like, zoning reform is not a panacea. And just put that out there right now to all of my YIMBY friends. It is necessary. It's a necessary part of the solution, but it doesn't solve everything. And so anyway, when I think about homelessness, I think about, well, prevention is a big part of it. And we should be spending as much of our dollars on making sure that people don't enter into it in the first place. Because once they cross that threshold, everything gets much worse and much more expensive to solve downstream. However, many people have already crossed that threshold. And so we have people who are a large population of chronically homeless people who need a higher level of care, and that is going to cost more money. Now, if we are doing a good job at preventing people from getting to that place, over time, the chronically homeless population should be shrinking. They should be getting rehoused or into treatment centers or whatever they need. And then hopefully we are building enough housing or whatever interventions we need to make on the front end so that people aren't coming in, or if they do, it's very quick. They get out very quickly. They're rapidly rehoused. Houston has a great rapid rehousing program where they've managed to dramatically shrink their total homeless population by 60, 70% over the past 10 years or so by, instead of building the housing themselves, they just pay rent. And they've been shown to have a 90% success rate in keeping people, even with drug addiction and mental illness, off the streets once they get rehoused. And part of the reason why they're able to do that is because rents are cheap in Houston, because they built a lot of housing, which is great. But I think they also put their money in the most important spot, which is right at that beginning gate. So that person who crossed the threshold, almost went into it, or immediately taken out of that homelessness spiral. If a city was going to spend $100,000 or $200,000 building permanent supportive housing, well, now that's however many months of rent, 200 months of rent maybe for somebody. So, you could see how those same dollars can go to a lot more people all at once. And so, they haven't solved everything. They still have a population, but relative to other cities of their side, it's a much lower per capita rate, including Austin, which I think could learn something from Houston, San Francisco for sure. So there are models I think that we can follow, but like if we're not doing the prevention, then we are just committing to making the problem permanent. And that's going to only be more and more expensive and catastrophic over time, not only for our cities at large, but for the individuals suffering through it.
I think that's such a great point. There are programs or research at least that shows that like people who are almost they're on the edge and they're about to enter homelessness, if they just have like a infusion of like $500, it actually changes their lives. And that $500 is way cheaper than the thousands and thousands of dollars that you're going to spend later on treatment and things like that. The same thing with Medicare. I mean, we in California specifically, we have a program where Medicare is allowed to purchase housing for people who are really high risk. And so what that means is, rent housing for people. But like what that means is like, instead of spending $10,000 a night in an emergency room, you can actually put them up for 6 months where their health will stabilize and improve, rather than them being on the street and then coming into the emergency room every few days to cost $10,000 per night. That's a huge savings. A $5,000 a month rent is way cheaper than $10,000 a night. I mean, if you think about it from that perspective. And those are the types of like interventions that I feel like we don't think in that. And this is going back to, again, to the biomedical versus the biopsychosocial model. This is like the biopsychosocial model is everybody, your community supports you. The government has your back in certain ways. You have this, way of seeing the problem before it happens. And so you can nip it in the bud, versus like the biomedical model, which is like, you're now in the hospital. How do we treat this? It's only a short-term solution unless there's something very acute, right?
Well, it's short-term or it's terminal.
Terminal. Yeah. And so I feel like that's a very good point. And, cutting all these services and things at the national level is not helping at all. Cutting healthcare costs, cutting prevention, cutting
Hmm.
science and research and all that
Yeah.
stuff that we can figure out how these things cascade, it's not necessarily helping.
Yeah. I mean, I do think the irony of all this too, though, is that like if we had a healthy housing system, if we funded these programs better, we could actually spend less money over time. We wouldn't require so much public intervention if we allowed the market to provide housing for the majority of people who'd be able to afford it. We would only have to focus on, deeply affordable. In Austin, we're getting to a point now where market rents are reaching into what was subsidized or had to be subsidized a few years ago. We could probably still go farther with that, but it should lead to policymakers to rethink how we're spending these dollars and could we put them to higher uses. I mean, the Austin model should just be every other city should look at this and just make it legal to build more housing.
Yeah.
which the city doesn't have to spend any money on, maybe paying the people writing the ordinance, you guys just have to pass it, and then save, San Francisco spending $750 million a year on this stuff. It's smaller, that's, I think, 5 times what Austin spends for a city that's 3/4 the size. Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, that's huge. I mean, I pay a lot of property taxes. I could tell you, like, they go to this stuff, and it's frustrating.
Yeah.
Another kind of idea is last week there was a law passed in Mexico City that was like basically a care infrastructure law where the folks in Mexico City said, well, we don't want to make this an individual burden. And so I think this is mostly for childcare, adult care, healthcare, those types of things. But it should be a societal burden or something that we should help everybody should help out with. And so they've basically passed this law that allows them to say, okay, well, these are the districts of the city. How do we make care functional in each of these districts? Do we need to build senior centers? Do we need to accredit more care professionals? Do we need to do this? And so I think, thinking about it from that point of view is a really fascinating way of thinking about how we can actually start to like systematize the way that we can actually get to that point where we are taking care of things before they get out of hand. And so there are models out there. I mean, the super blocks in Barcelona, part of their charge is actually making things closer for people so they can actually get more care infrastructure available to them. The same thing in other countries. I think Melissa and Chris Bruntlett talked in their book recently about Bogota doing something similar. So I think there's like ways we can do this. It'll be a little bit of work, but it actually might be good to front load it rather than at the end, as we were just talking about.
Everything is so much more expensive at the end.
Yeah. I want to ask you one more thing. It's not about the care topic, but it is about Austin specifically.
Yeah.
You wrote recently about the gap in state enthusiasm for light rail versus massive road expansion.
Yeah.
And this is one of my hobby horses. My master's report at the University of Texas was about light rail and the history of it. I finished it in 2005, so it's probably out of date a little bit.
But you would have been here the first time Austin voted on light rail.
Yeah, I was here in 2000. I was here in 2004 when they voted for what is now Metro Rail. I promoted streetcars, which maybe was not the best idea in the long run. But I'm wondering if folks have actually taken kind of to heart that recent report that TxDOT made that said we need more than roads to give people access to good services, institutions, because amazingly, TxDOT did put out this report saying we need to do more than roads, but TxDOT is still, going to spend $5 billion in Austin. It's still going to spend money expanding I-10 and I-45 in Houston. Obviously, Dallas has its stuff going on. So I'm curious if that's actually permeated any membranes there in Texas.
I mean, this is a sorting problem, I think, because I'm surrounded by housing and transit advocates all the time. So certainly in the people I talk to, in the advocacy space at the city, everybody is kind of aware of this and wants that and is pushing for it. But then we move to the, metropolitan planning organization level, and in the Central Texas, it's called Campo. And Austin, which is the largest political entity on that body, is a minority voice. So the surrounding suburbs are still very much oriented towards we need to build roads, we need to expand highways, we need to make it easier to get into the city. And so we'll just bulldoze the city to do that. So I would say, even though some good people at TxDOT understand the limitations of the problem, there's one, just the culture is not quite there in Texas. And two, the Constitution is not there either. You basically can't spend money in Texas on anything but highways. So it's going to take the culture to change more broadly, I think, for that to translate into something that appears, as a bill. I wouldn't expect it to be next session. We're going to have to convince a bunch of people who live in suburban places that we need alternate modes going forward. But meanwhile, TxDOT is still following the logic that it has grown accustomed to over its history. And we're expanding I-35 through central Austin. We're trying to expand MOPAC on the west side of town, which is,
good luck with that.
Good luck.
Good luck with Terrytown.
Yeah. So it's still a problem. I mean, it's encouraging though that they put that out there. And so, kudos to them for recognizing that there is a problem. How we actually take steps to solve it, of course, is much harder. And I think will take much more time and longer term advocacy.
And then my last question for you, what's most exciting to you in this space right now?
Well, I'm very embedded in Austin zoning reform, land use issues here. I see a lot of interesting things on the zoning commission, but our city council recently put forth or passed a resolution to direct city staff to actually make buildable missing middle zones within the city. So in theory, you could build an 8-plex in a single family neighborhood or a small apartment building with a coffee shop at the bottom of it. This is basically impossible under code currently. Our zones reflect a kind of suburban planning mentality, I would say. And so this would allow us to get to a more urban form, which would be great in the central city. I live in, to your point about streetcars, I live in central East Austin, which was a streetcar suburb of, the original square mile of the city. And downtown is surrounded by several of them. Hyde Park, Terrytown all had streetcars running to them. We ripped them out by the 1940s. I think we sent the metal to Germany in the form of planes and warships and whatnot.
Gotcha. I was like, did you send them to Germany or you sent them?
Yeah, they were transmuted into a new form and then dropped on the Nazis for a good cause.
These streetcars fight Nazis, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So, Austin has a lot of great, urban bones. I think, we've got a nice street grid in many parts of the central city, and we could have this great transit-oriented place, but we don't have the density for it. All of the neighborhoods surrounding downtown are zoned for single family, and under some recent zoning reform, you can do 3 homes by right on a single family lot, which is great, but it is not enough to really make our transit systems work for everybody. So if we can get that passed, which we are hoping to do in the next 12 months, then we need to get it mapped. And if we can do that, then maybe we'll get a city here after all. A denser city.
I believe there is a city underneath it all.
Yeah. There's a city that is trying to emerge.
There you go. This chrysalis. Well, Ryan, where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
I would be happy to be found on Substack. You can find me at thecityofyes.com or ryanpuzycki.com. We'll have that in the show notes so you don't have to figure out how to spell it.
I'll put the links in for sure.
Thanks.
Well, Ryan, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
It's been a pleasure, Jeff. I appreciate it.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire, published first at StreetsPog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/TheOverheadWire. You can sign up for our 20-year-old newsletter as well and find everything else, including multiple ways to support the show at TheOverheadWire.com. You can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.